let's talk about the step-by-step destruction, intentional, of the gold standard. So the first step, actually there were steps before this. We had something called the national banking system, which tended to centralize control over banking in the large Wall Street banks. So we were moving towards centralization even before this. And we were moving towards undermining the gold standard. But right before Christmas, in President Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. Wilson declares it the first of a series of constructive acts to aid business. They left out the word big, to aid big business and big banks. This is really the agenda of the progressive era, was to aid big business. And that was one of the most important steps in that direction. So let's move on to the next few steps. So the classical gold standard, as I said, existed from 1834 to 1933 in the U.S. More or less. It got watered down after the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act. So the Fed immediately started mucking things up. It's mucking with an M. During World War I, gold reserves were centralized in the Fed, so now you suddenly had the Fed able to operate as a lender of last resort, which of course introduces systemic moral hazard into the whole financial system. They placed a heavy tax on private issue of notes. They wanted to drive private notes out of existence, and they prohibited gold from being exported in 1917. In the 1920s, they finally outlawed the private issue of banknotes because they wanted people to think of not gold, but a government-issued paper as money. So they wanted people to become familiar with government paper. There was a big propaganda campaign, by the way, on the part of the banks and the government against using gold in the 1920s. You're old-fashioned. Who does this? Your grandfather did this, but that's ridiculous. You're safer and your money's more secure. And it's more convenient if you carry the Federal Reserve notes. So people began to attach the name dollar, not to the weight of gold, but to the piece of paper that was a claim to gold. Murray Rothbard stresses that change from weight to name. It began to occur under the gold standard itself, when gold reserves were centralized. And you were even discouraged you could withdraw gold during the 1920s, but you were discouraged from doing so. They would be slow in doing it. They'll tell you to come back in a few days or whatever, or they'd berate you out loud in front of other customers at the bank and so on for being so old-fashioned. And then, of course, they cut reserve requirements in half, and that doubled the money supply during World War II, and we had a big boom, which was followed by the last Austrian-style recession of 1920-1921, in which prices and wages fell very rapidly, fell very deeply, sharply, but the economy adjusted and moved out of the recession pretty quickly. So the Fed also expanded bank reserves during the 1920s. It discovered open market operations in which, if it just bought government bonds from the public, it realized it could increase the money supply. So it did that to help out Great Britain to get back on the gold standard. We then had the Great Depression when the Fed hiked interest rates and stopped expanding the money supply as quickly in 1928 and 1929. And we had the beginning of the Great Depression, and we had, of course, the stock market collapse. 1933, there were periods of holiday in March, and then when the banks reopened, it was reopened with the promise that they would insure all deposits that were in banks. And then in May, a few months later, they outlawed the ownership of gold and then devalued it. They defined the dollar as 1/35 of an ounce of gold. They reduced the amount of gold in the dollar.